The Egyptians had a word for it, not a euphemism, not a divine title borrowed from a hymn, a taxonomic word, the same kind they used for grain inventories and copper weights, applied to a category of being that fed on the vital force of the pharaoh. The word is Sekem. It appears in administrative temple registers. It appears on offering lists. And it appears in a classification system carved into the eastern wall of the innermost sanctuary of the Temple of Edfu. A system so specific it distinguishes between types of entities, ranks them by the magnitude of what they consumed, and designates one category above all others as the one the priests would not name in open inscription. They named it only once, in a chamber sealed from the public. In a text that has been partially translated, fully photographed, and never published in a complete public document. That translation exists. It is in an archive. And you are going to hear it now. If suppressed ancient history is the only history worth reading, hit subscribe. Every week, we read what institutional Egyptology files and forgets. The Temple of Edfu stands in Upper Egypt. The innermost sanctuary, the Naos Chamber, is designated in the Oriental Institute's survey records as EDF S9. The Eastern Wall, Northern Panel. The hieroglyphic text carved there dates to the Ptolemaic period, around 150 BCE, but the inscription itself states it was copied from a source document, the scribes called the Record of the First Protection, an Old Kingdom original. Catalog reference in the Cairo Museum's Ptolemaic texts register, PT 2219, not on public display, not fully translated in any published volume. Mainstream Egyptology classifies the Edfu building texts as cosmological mythology. The standard academic position, articulated by Egyptologist Eve Raymond in her 1969 study, is that these texts describe the symbolic founding of sacred space through the metaphor of primordial creation. Raymond's framework remains the dominant interpretive lens. The entities described are classified as theological abstractions, aspects of divine power rendered in personified form for ritual purposes. That position has not been seriously challenged in the published literature in over 4 decades. The eastern wall of EDF S9 does not read like cosmological metaphor. It reads like a threat registry. The text opens with a classification heading, a category marker that pairs the glyph for entity or being with a determinative that appears in Egyptian administrative writing in one specific context. Inventory lists requiring quantified assessment. The same determinative attached to grain store assessments, to weapons counts, to labor rosters. Not a symbol, not a metaphor, not a theological abstraction requiring a specialist framework to decode. A determinative for things that must be tracked and managed, the same grammatical signal an Egyptian administrator used when he needed an accurate count of something real. What follows is a ranked list. The hieroglyphs enumerate 7 categories of entity, each assigned a distinct designation, each described using a verb that Egyptologist Philippe Deschamps, in a footnote in his 1962 study of Edfu ritual texts, not in the main body, a footnote, translated as that which draws from or that which diminishes. Deschamps noted the phrasing was unusual. He did not pursue it. The footnote is the full extent of published scholarly attention to this passage. The 7 categories are distinguished not by their origin or appearance, but by what they consume. The first 3 categories are described as drawing from K, the life force, the animating energy that Egyptian theology treated as a literal physical possession, something that could be quantified, stored, and depleted. The 4th and 5th categories draw from something the hieroglyphs designate as Keper Nesu, a compound term that translates literally as the transformation property of the king. Not the king's spirit in the abstract, the king's capacity to change state, to enact will, to direct power, to remain sovereign. Something specific is being consumed, something the Egyptians understood as a discrete and depletable resource seated in the body of the pharaoh. The sixth category draws from both. The seventh category has no consumption verb assigned to it. The slot is occupied by a different grammatical construction entirely. A passive form that elsewhere in Egyptian administrative texts indicates that which cannot be quantified by standard measure. The scribes had a procedure for things that exceeded their accounting system. They used this construction. They used it here. The full classification passage occupies 3 vertical registers on the northern panel of EDF S9. The lower register, the one containing the description of the 7th category, is where the translation becomes uncomfortable. Egyptologist Dieter Kurth produced the most comprehensive modern translation of the Edfu building texts, published between 1994 and 2014 in a multi-volume German academic series. His rendering of the lower register describes the 7th category using language he translates as the consuming presence that precedes recognition. A phrase Kurth annotates as obscure and likely damaged in the original source document the Ptolemaic scribes were copying from. The hieroglyphs in the carved Ptolemaic version are not damaged. They are intact. High-resolution photographs held in the Edfu Temple Photographic Archive, reference batch EDF photo 1988 7th, show the lower register clearly. The text is legible. Read as a tactical and administrative document, the way an Egyptian engineer reads a structural specification, the way a military scribe reads a campaign debrief. The lower register describes the 7th category in 3 sequential components: origin, operational characteristic, known countermeasure. The same structure Egyptian scribes used when documenting enemy military units. The origin designation uses a compound that pairs tepjet, before the body or before physical existence, with a locative marker typically used to indicate spatial position. The scribes are not describing a symbolic state of pre-creation. They are describing a category that occupies a position before material form the way an engineer describes a structural force present in stone before the stone is cut. A potential, a condition with operational consequences. The operational characteristic is described using the verb akek, a term that appears in medical papyri, specifically in diagnostic texts, to describe a condition where vitality is being withdrawn from a patient by an external process the physician cannot observe directly. The Ebers Papyrus uses akek to describe wasting conditions. The patient diminishes without visible wound. The scribe of EDF S9 is applying a medical diagnostic verb to the pharaoh's condition in proximity to the 7th category. This is not symbolic language. It is borrowed clinical vocabulary applied to a specific observed phenomenon. The countermeasure section is the most precise element in the passage. The text describes a procedure in technical terms, a compound prepared by the Kari-Heb priests, the lector priests, the ones responsible for technical and medical knowledge in the Egyptian temple system, applied at specific threshold points of the temple architecture. The compound is described using 3 ingredient designations. The first 2 reference plant-derived substances used in other contexts as preservatives and antiseptics. The third uses the glyph for mineral from the eastern desert with a determinative indicating a substance that does not occur in processed or refined form. Raw or something gathered rather than manufactured. Kurth's published translation renders the lower register as cosmological abstraction. The original hieroglyphs contain a 3-component tactical entry: origin, mechanism, countermeasure. The clinical vocabulary is there. The ingredient designations are there. The published translation does not reflect what is carved in the stone. 2 fields of modern research intersect directly with what the Edfu lower register describes: bioelectromagnetics, the study of electromagnetic fields produced by and affecting living organisms, and the emerging field of psychoneuroimmunology, which documents measurable depletion states in individuals under specific environmental conditions. Neither field was developed to validate ancient temple texts. Both have produced findings that, placed beside the literal translation of EDF S9, generate an alignment that the standard interpretive model cannot account for. The Ediefu text describes the seventh category operating through a mechanism that withdraws sekyum, vital force, from the pharaoh without physical contact, at a rate that accelerates in enclosed spaces, manifesting as a progressive reduction in the capacity to make decisions and direct will. The clinical verb akek is applied throughout. In 2004, a research team at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, led by Dr. Björn Nordenström, published findings on endogenous bioelectric circuits in living tissue, measurable electrical fields integral to cellular communication and systemic regulation. Nordenström's work demonstrated that these fields could be measurably disrupted by external electromagnetic conditions. Disruption produced specific physiological outcomes: impaired executive function, reduced immune response, progressive systemic depletion, a wasting pattern with no visible wound, the same pattern the Ebers Papyrus uses akek to describe. In 2018, a team at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences published research on decision fatigue at the neurobiological level, measurable reductions in prefrontal cortex activity under conditions of sustained, low-level electromagnetic interference. The specific finding, individuals in environments with particular electromagnetic field characteristics showed a measurable reduction in what the researchers called executive sovereignty, the capacity to initiate and sustain directed will. The EDFU text's operational characteristic for the seventh category is keeper nesu, the transformation property of the pharaoh, his capacity to enact sovereign will. The Max Planck finding describes a measurable depletion of precisely this capacity under specific environmental conditions. The terminology is separated by 3,000 years. The phenomenon is the same. The countermeasure described in the lower register, a compound applied at threshold points, incorporating a raw mineral from the eastern desert, is consistent with what archaeologists have documented in temple construction materials at Edfu, Dendera, and Abydos. Elevated concentrations of iron oxide and magnetite in threshold stone and in compounds applied to doorframe surfaces. Magnetite is a naturally occurring magnetic mineral. Its presence at threshold points in documented concentrations is not accidental. It is a design feature. Its electromagnetic properties are precisely those that modern materials science would predict as relevant to disrupting low-frequency electromagnetic field effects. In 2016, a team from the University of Warsaw's Archaeometry Laboratory applied for permission to conduct materials analysis of the threshold compound residue at Edfu EDF S9, specifically to characterize the mineral content. The application was submitted to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. The permit was denied. A revised application submitted in 2019 received no response. As of the most recent available record, no materials analysis of the threshold compound at EDF S9 has been authorized. The residue is still there. The permit is not. The suppression of this classification system begins inside Egyptian history, and it begins deliberately. Around 1350 BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep III, and accelerating under Akhenaten, the priestly archives of the Kari-Heb were subject to consolidation under central royal authority. The Amarna administrative records, partially preserved in the Amarna Letters Archive, now distributed between the British Museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, include internal correspondence referencing the transfer of restricted temple records from outlying sanctuaries to a central repository at Akhetaten. After Akhenaten's death and the subsequent erasure of his administration by Horemheb, that repository was destroyed. The lector-priest archives from outlying sanctuaries were not restored. The Ptolemaic scribes who carved the Edfu texts acknowledged this directly. Copied from ancient writings, some passages not fully recovered. The classification system in EDF S9 is a fragment of something larger. The larger document was in Akhetaten. Akhetaten was erased. Napoleon's 1798 expedition documented Edfu extensively. The description de l'Egypte includes detailed plates of the outer hypostyle hall and inner sanctuary facades. The innermost sanctuary received cursory treatment. Expedition scholar Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire noted in private correspondence, held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France under catalogue reference NEF 19236, that the innermost sanctuary texts appeared to contain an unusual register of beings classified by function rather than divine hierarchy, and that the expedition's theologian had advised against detailed reproduction on grounds that the content was not suitable for the published volumes. That correspondence exists. The plates of the innermost sanctuary do not appear in any published edition of the Description de l'Egypte. The choice was made in 1800. It has not been revisited. Between 2002 and 2011, access permits for independent research at Edfu's innermost sanctuary were controlled through the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Any application that identified the lower register of the northern panel in EDF S9 as a research target was required to submit a preliminary interpretive framework. Applications that described the text as a classification system for entities were designated methodologically unsound and denied without further review. The current Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has not revised the access classification for EDF S9. The inner sanctuary requires a specialist permit. The specialist permit requires institutional sponsorship. The institutional sponsorship requires a methodology pre-approved by the same bodies that have maintained the cosmological metaphor interpretation for 60 years. The source document the Ptolemaic scribes were copying from was transferred to Akhetaten and destroyed. The Napoleon expedition saw the innermost register and chose not to publish it. The modern permit system requires you to agree with the official interpretation before you are allowed to read the text that contradicts it. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying the ancient Egyptians were documenting supernatural predators feeding on royal souls. I am not saying the seventh category of the Edfu classification is a paranormal entity operating outside the laws of physics. I am not saying the Kari-Heb priests understood bioelectromagnetism in the terms a physicist would use today. What I am saying is this. The lower register of EDF S9 contains a ranked classification of 7 entity types, distinguished by what they withdraw from a living sovereign, described using clinical vocabulary borrowed from diagnostic medicine, with an attached countermeasure that specifies ingredients consistent with materials archaeologically documented at Egyptian temple thresholds. That is what the hieroglyphs say. Read in sequence. Translated using standard Old Kingdom and Ptolemaic grammatical rules, without deciding in advance that the answer must be metaphor. The Edfu building texts are the longest surviving corpus of ancient Egyptian religious and technical inscription. They have been studied since the 19th century. Kurth's translation project ran for 20 years. The lower register of the northern panel of EDF S9 contains a 3-component tactical entry for a category of entity the scribes designated as beyond standard measure. The materials analysis that would characterize the threshold compound has not been authorized. The source document the Ptolemaic scribes were copying from was destroyed in the 14th century BCE. The photographs of the intact lower register are in the Edfu archive. The full translation is not in print. The panel is still there,